Good afternoon. Ni hao. Dear students, I am Igor Lімборський and I am a professor of Rauf Ablazov East European University. And today we have a lecture on the lecture course International Management. It is lecture number 1, International Management, Structure and Features. Today we can give the following definition of international management. International management is a special type of management, the main goals of which are the formation, development and use of the competitive advantages of the company through the opportunities of doing business in different countries and the appropriate use of economic, social, demographic, cultural and other features of these countries and cross-country cooperation. Like any definition that belongs to such a complex category, this definition is incomplete and to a certain extent one-sided. Its main task is to emphasize the general commonality of international and country management as genetically closely related categories, and on the other hand, to highlight its main specific feature, the use in the search and implementation of competitive advantages of all those opportunities that open up business activity within countries and the interaction of these countries. Since there is a genetic homogeneity that in principle the structure of international management should be similar to the structure of national or country management, that is, it should include problems covering 5 main areas of corporate business management: research analysis and evaluation of the external business environment and the internal environment of the organization, communication and decision-making process, including models and methods, basic management functions, strategic planning and implementation of strategies, building organizations, motivation, control and coordination, issues of group dynamics and leadership, questions of the effectiveness of the company's activities, personnel management, production, marketing, performance management in general. This structural similarity should in no case obscure to the fact that within each of the structurally similar parts of the category there are quite important differences with the national model, and it is advisable to proceed to their consideration. The basic difference is the content, role and specificity of the external business environment, since in our case we are talking about its going beyond national boundaries. Operating in several foreign-speaking countries, especially all over the world, makes us pay special attention to the analysis of the external environment and, first of all, everything that potentially carries certain competitive advantages: economics, politics, law, culture, social processes, and other aspects of the life of a particular national state in the context of strategic and tactical tasks solved by a company on its territory and or with the help of companies from this country in third countries. At the same time, as noted, knowledge and understanding of the culture of the country and the corresponding behavioral characteristic of its population plays one of the key roles and carries a charge of fundamentally new competitive advantages or dangers in the negative version. In addition, serious management of international business is a significant scale requires a qualitatively different information base, unconditional overcoming of language barriers, and professional insurance support for management decisions. Here and in what follows, of course, we have in mind a sufficiently developed international business that is an appropriate level of depth of its penetration into the international business environment. As for international environment of the company, here both the difficulties and differences are determined by the same multinational environment. Although such defining categories as goals, structure, division of labor within the company, coordination, and even more so technological ones do not carry significant differences from the national model, but as soon as we get to the main thing, people, their needs, perceptions, expectations, and most importantly, the values and goals of behavior, this view becomes more than controversial. And the reason is the same: the need to take into account national and cultural factors. We will discuss these in more detail later, but for now, just by way of illustration, we note that the almost half of the Japanese consider work primarily as a livelihood, while among the Belgians or Dutch, this percentage does not reach even a third of all respondents. Or another equally revealing fact: time, plans, and programs are the most important element of Western culture in general and management in particular, while Eastern culture simply does not accept the idea that there will be no second chance and treats time as kind of endless resource. Even more serious problems are faced by international management in the field of communications, where everything from the peculiarities of language barriers to rituals and non-verbal communication bears a hard imprint of the specifics of the particular culture. But it is precisely the features of communications that largely determine the national and cultural specifics of decision-making. What in one culture will be a model of a rational decision-making, in another will be considered simply unreasonable behavior of the leader. And this is all the more true if we take into account the significant differences between different cultures, as already mentioned above. To a much lesser extent, the specificity of international management affects the transition to the problems of strategic planning. After all, more or less, formalized models are much more sensitive to the cultural environment. Here, of course, the specifics of interaction and information exchange inherent in different nations will manifest themselves. But within the rather rigid framework of corporate models for developing a strategy, this is a completely surmountable obstacle. However, in another respect, the problem of strategic planning in international business is much more complicated. We are talking about the most difficult problem of the correlation of global and local optimums in the activities of an international company, and accordingly in even more difficult problems of component formation and development of relations between a company and the host country as a whole, its individual regions and cities. It is not uncommon when the global optimization of the company's activities requires, for example, the closure of its production department in a given country or a reduction in supplies to a given national market, and etc. Without further explanation, it is clear how painful such decisions are perceived by local authorities and the population, which has its own ideas about optimality. But it is precisely these kinds of problems that one has to face when developing a firm's international business strategy. And the quality of their solution is a sure sign of the quality of international management as a whole. And in addition to this, there are extremely subtle issues of accounting for political risks in a particular country, the social dynamics of its population, and etc. In its entirety, the complexities of the multi- and cross-national approach inherent in international business are manifested in the functional section of company management in areas of motivation and control, since it is here and also in group dynamics that cultural constants make themselves felt especially strongly, and illiterate in cultural context. The manager's decision may, in a particular country, simply call into question the activities of the department of the firm as a whole. The special place of group behavior and the importance of groups in any management system is well known. However, significant differences in the role of the group in different types of cultures are no less known in cultural studies. From the purely Western model, in which the informal group is a rather spontaneous reaction to unsatisfied individual needs, to the Japanese model, in which the group is absolutely natural and often the most important part of the corporate social structure, and more generally speaking, the structure of society as a whole. In this sense, what is still an object of lively discussion for the West, the role, significance of group norms, group unanimity, and etc. For the East, the issue has long been resolved and self-evident. But within the framework of a single structure of the corporate society, it is extremely difficult for an international manager to combine these views and adopt his decisions to the cultural characteristics of individual national parts of the company. And exactly the same applies to issues of power, leadership, and participation of ordinary members of the team in decision making. Ronan, a well-known researcher of cultural differences, gives an interesting example of a dialogue between an American leader and a Greek subordinate. The American, in full accordance with the norms of his managerial culture, seeks to involve the employer in the decision-making process about his own work, its nature, duration, volume, while the Greek, guided by his ideas, perceives all his efforts in their final result as the incompetence and indecision of the leader. In a more simplified version, this episode could be interpreted as follows. The American is inclined towards a democratic style of government, while the Greek prefers an authoritarian one. But in the context of a serious approach to international management, the whole point of the matter is that the Greek does not choose at all. His culture predetermines the obligation of a normal boss to take decisions independently and be competent enough for this. In exactly the same way, the influence in almost any type of Eastern cultures will be very significantly determined by age, while in Western models, the influence of this factor will be very moderate and may even have negative aspects. The same is true with respect to the role and influence of traditions, but the latter have deeper features, and in order to understand the essence of international management, this should be considered in more detail. Step 1. Accounting for traditions. Traditionalism is inherent in almost equal measure in different cultures, often with diametrically opposed value orientations and motivational constants. Suffice it to mention at least the English and Japanese cultural traditions. The first is not only truly Western, but can also be considered a kind of a progenitor of Western models of behavior. In any case, if the classics are firmly convinced of the basic role of Protestant ethics in the development of Western democracy and the free market, then it is unlikely that English birthright can be contested. And here, adherence to a strictly observed tradition from seemingly insignificant legal recognized by the whole society. Principles to strict etiquette honored over the centuries is a basic feature of the national stereotype of behavior. But exactly the same can be said about the Japanese model. The same careful preservation of traditions and strict adherence to the canons of the national way of life. However, both nations demonstrate, especially the Japanese, advanced positions in scientific and technological progress. That is, traditionalism does not interfere. Rather, in both nations, it plays a kind of filtering role. Everything progressive is taken from any sphere of human achievements, scientific and technical, social, economic, etc. But their influence on the national culture background, and especially on the possibility of its serious deformations. In the context of specific national patterns of behavior, we now note the most important thing, taking into account the most serious influence of traditionalism for an international manager does not at all boil down a constant fear of not hurting tradition. The statement here is much more subtle. To assess predict to what extent certain actions, innovations, ideas will either be supported by local tradition or natural in relation to it, and therefore quite realizable, or rather negative. But in this case, it is possible to present something new in a such way as to eliminate or significantly reduce the negative impact. It should be also be borne in mind the reasonable attitude to the local community to the need for a certain change in traditional patterns of behavior. And this is a common point of view in almost all countries whose state regimes are not on extremely radical positions of a political, religious, or social nature. In other words, here we come to the category of susceptibility to change. Step 2. Change management. In general, at a more global level, in the context of international management, various aspects of change management play a special role. All social, economic, technical, and any other progress goes through changes, and susceptibility of the national culture to them as a fundamental problem of international management. And if the well-known model of organizational change management by Larry Gradner, one of the theorists of international management, works well for Western models of behavior, then an attempt to apply it to Eastern culture is already problematic at the first step. The pressure of external circumstances, a powerful incentive for the barrier of Western culture, may not be taken into account for a long time in conditions of people readiness to be content with little and show humility and submissiveness to circumstances. And this is a characteristic feature of many Eastern and mixed cultures. Equally important is an objective look at the source of change. For radicals, the very fact that change comes from political or religious communities or countries they hate is reason enough to simply ignore them. There are also situations that are extraordinary, and solutions are already in the process of overcoming resistance to change. The Western approach emphasizes openness and employee involvement in decision-making, but in other cultures, this may be perceived by staff as evidence of weak leadership and inability to lead people, not to mention the lack of such a quality as decisiveness in pursuing a policy of change. In Western culture, stands on the point of view, changes are good only insofar as they are understood and accepted by the performers. Then in other cultures, this can be formulated as changes are useful insofar as this boss is convinced of this. And it is not the business of subordinates to discuss these issues. It is necessary just follow orders. But, for example, the same culture of Japanese management offers an intensive exchange of information both at one level of the management hierarchy and between levels to develop not only more responsible decisions, but if possible, all decisions in general. And here we are faced with a kind of intermediate form given by the national model of management and, as it were, reconciling both extreme positions noted above. In general, such a rich managerial and cultural palette is a characteristic feature of a developed international management. We spoke about the phenomenon of extracting the best from national models. Naturally, situational specificity is strictly superimposed on all this, which is constantly taken into account by the international manager. Indeed, an intensive exchange of information in the interest of developing optimal solutions is good and useful in friendly structures, but in the conditions of a unit or even an entire organization torn apart by internal conflicts, just the opposite effect takes place. Accordingly, cultural specificity interacts with the situational one in a rather complicated way. Third step: performance management. There is no need for a long-term evidence of the indisputable fact that the success, achievement, and rational evaluation of an employee's performance play paramount role in managing the effectiveness of an organization for any country in Europe and North America. But if we turn to the regions of the Near and Middle East, in India, China, or even Japan, then the picture becomes significantly different, since the role of personal achievement and personal success as powerful motivators of effective work is considerably less here. In this case, we do not consider the issue in more depth. If, for example, we talk about the Indian cultural stereotype, then what can be defined as an internal achievement or self-improvement of the individual plays a much larger role there. In Japanese culture, the place of personal achievement is much more modest than the participation of the employer in achieving the success of the group. One thing is clear: if an international manager tried to work with the same tools in different cultural traditions. Step 4. International management and comparative management. Let's finish with this overview excursion into separate sections of management, the local problems of which we considered in the context of international management, and formulate the main conclusion. The main features of international management, one way or another, lie in the field of accounting and use in the management of national and multinational teams, of everything that culture gives in the broadest sense of this category. This, in turn, means that a comprehensive study of the phenomenon of culture in a comparative context, analysis and evaluation of the opportunities and limitations that culture constants carry, is an absolute condition for the success of international management. In other words, everything that comparative management does should be considered the methodological basis of international management. In this sense, any person studying international management must simultaneously, and even with a certain lead, master the basics of comparative management, that is, be sufficiently familiar with the methodology of the issue. This is the main characteristic of the category international management from the point of view of its only fundamental difference from national management, the need to take into account the cultural component. Next stage. Target orientation of the international firm. Now let's turn to the second part of this category, that is, to those of its structural elements that can be considered features but not fundamental difference from the national model. The target orientation of a company that has decided to go into international business, as noted above, is concentrated in three main areas. First, search and development of new markets. Second, search and use of effective resources. 3. The use of opportunities that open up for business with the framework of a given country and/or inter-country legal environment. On the other hand, there are sort of variables that mediate this target list. First, the level of economic development of individual countries. Second, cultural similarity, difference of the home country and host countries. Third, natural features of countries, including mineral resources, water, climate, etc. And the last, characteristics of the country's demography, population, its location on the territory, level of urbanization, etc. If we now include some third axis of formation in this structure, then its main characteristic will be the depth of the firm's involvement in international business noted at the end of the first section. We also use the term level of internalization. In turn, the quality of international management along this axis will be determined by how fully it uses the global opportunities of the world business service in the interest of the company. And in this sense, a company that opens trade and even production branches abroad may gravitate towards less real international management. Poorly quantitative structural growth fully provided by the main divisions of the company in the home country go to its constant qualitative growth when the company business makes the most of all the possibilities of the international information network, international financial markets, transnational movements of labor, etc. Combining all these with the extraction of the best country management models and their adaptation to specifics of different host countries, international management turns into a management system at the most advanced stage of its evolution knowledge, for which information collected and analyzed all over the world becomes the main strategic resource, and adaptability, cultural, legal, economic, situational, political, and social, is the main strategic weapon. Next stage. Tasks and of international management. Now we can summarize all the above highlighting within the framework of the main target orientation of international management, those of its tasks that to the greatest extent bear the specifics of the economic category. First, a comprehensive study, analysis and assessment of the external environment of international business in the interest of finding and implementing of sources of the company's competitive advantages. Second, an in-depth analysis and assessment of the cultural background in each country of residence and the use of its capabilities, taking into account limitations in the development of strategic, tactical, and operational decisions on the functioning and development of the company both in this country and in general. 3. Evaluation, selection, and practical use of organizational forms within which foreign operations of the company are carried out in order to maximize the effect of using the economic potential and legal possibilities of the host countries. 4. Formation and development of a multinational team of the company and on its division in the home country and in the host countries in the interest of maximizing the personal potential of employers, the capabilities of individual teams, and cross-national effects from their interaction within the company. 5. Such development and effective use of various opportunities of international business service, and above all in these areas of financial, technological, and information services for economic operations. It is clear that the level of international specificity in each of the 5 identified tasks is significantly different, and moreover varies significantly even within one task, depending on the specific issue considered with its framework. As noted, this specificity reaches its maximum in the second task, taking into account the cultural background, but it is relatively moderate in the area of assessment and choice of organizational forms. And within the framework of the 5th task, this specificity is very rigidly manifested. For example, in extremely subtle issues of currency regulation, but again it is more moderate, for example, in the use of forfeiting. After all, with all the complexity of such international transactions, their national basis is bill calculation is quite well developed in national financial transactions. This remark is important in the context of a lively discussion that is going on around how big the specifics of international management are compared to national ones. In the end, the answer to this question depends entirely on the complexity of solving these problems themselves and on what problems the company has to solve inside each of them. And this, as noted above, is directly related to the level of internationalization of the company's activities. Concluding the consideration of the material, we in essence have defined the content of the textbook in the most general terms. All its subsequent chapters, one way or another, fit into the 5 tasks formulated above that provide specific recommendations and practical tools for their solution. And the natural basis for such consideration is a fairly detailed analysis of the external environment of international business. The external environment in which the company operates is fundamentally important for any business, regardless of its direction and scale. But for international business, it has a very special meaning. If everything in your own country is more or less familiar, then entering the international market, a company often finds itself not only in unfamiliar economic, political, social, and cultural environment, but no less important, and in situation where the possibilities of sources of its studies and sources of its study and adequate assessment are far from obvious. That is why the issues of the approach methodology, what exactly is studied in the external environment, how it is studied, what follows from this study, how the assessment of the opportunities and dangers of the external environment should be built, acquire a paramount role and are discussed in great detail in almost every serious work on international business and international management. At the same time, of course, the genetic commonality of each of the approach is preserved. That is, those techniques and methods that are used to study the country's external environments remain in force. However, they are significantly supplemented and modified in relation to the peculiarities of international business. A comprehensive analysis and assessment of the external environment in which the famous international will operate and develop is the most important moment in the preparation of all strategic and many tactical decisions of the international manager. Here there is a unanimous agreement in both business practitioners and theorists of international business management and marketing. There are equally unanimous opinion that the following elements should be the basic components of such an analysis. Analysis of the economic external environment. 2. Analysis of the political external environment. 3. Analysis of the legal environment. 4. Analysis of the cultural environment. And now the conclusions. What does the international manager really take out for his practical work, having mastered the material of this lecture? The answer to this question can be reduced to the following main thesis. He must understand the specifics of what he has to manage, that is, the international business itself, and starting from this, determine the depth of his company's involvement in international business, which is optimal for a given level of development of the company. 2. He gets the opportunity to most professionally consider the company's capabilities from the point of view of business globalization, that is, to strategically determine how, for example, technological globalization can help to effectively enter international business. 3. He must become a convinced and active supporter of the cultural approach, that is, a deep study of the cultural factor background in the interest of increasing the efficiency of international business management. 4. He receives an extremely important opportunity to acquire a truly professional view of the relationship between global and local optimums in the activities of international firm. 5. We can reasonably and rationally use his national management model, adopted it to the characteristics of international business. 6. Finally, he competently sets those basic tasks that an international manager must systematically solve in the process of work. And dear students, now we see the literature to this lecture. You can use these books while preparing to the practical lessons. Zeit. Goodbye.